For example, there's often a higher degree of ability for them to have some sort of intercommunication on the mind level, to know what the other one is going to say, or to speak. In some rare cases, they can even speak the same words at the same moment, indicating that there's some sort of a link between them when they're very close. But in addition to that, you'll often see things where they live 1,000 miles apart, but on the same day, unknown to each other, they met the woman that they were going to marry, and her first name was exactly the same name. So there are some unusual correspondences that I think that perhaps are accounted for by the similarity in their birth times, but can't really be explained in a scientific sense as yet. You know, and I think that the psychologists want very much to understand that.
Let me ask you a question. How then could you, as an astrologer that wants to test it scientifically, how could you devise a test with what you just told me? Because what you're saying is, yeah, they're close to being the same, but really when you get down to testing it, there's too many variables and just a few minutes makes too much difference. You couldn't test it then?
Well, if you could get a case where there's only 2 minutes apart in birth time, the Earth wouldn't have rotated that much. There would be very little difference. The charts would be almost identical. So you could, that would be a pretty good test. Those births, okay, are extremely rare. So the average astrologer wouldn't have access to that kind of data more than once or so in his lifetime. What's difficult about identical twins is it's difficult to get enough data to do a test. That's the real problem.
John, a good test for that would be to have a baby born, 2 babies in the same hospital born at the same time.
What I found, I haven't done thousands, but I've done many. I found that identical twins, if they're truly identical, are polar opposites in many, many ways. They're so close that what you do, what I do, is I take the birth chart of one and I actually invert it and make it the polar opposite. And the parents to whom I read the chart, to whom I've read these charts, are astounded because identical twins are not identical. Yes, they do say the same thing at the same time, and their lives do parallel, absolutely. But because of the, and when you actually just take one and make it the polar opposite, you actually invert the chart, you're able to read them. And that's what you do in the case, that's what I do in the case.
Can I throw out
well, Karen, I'd like a comment from you. What do you think?
Well, it's just having 4 children myself and having helped raise a number of children, and, you know, having dealt with a couple of cases of twins, but also children who are close to each other in the same family, I think it's a psychological phenomena, you know, what you interpret astrologically, that if people are close, they are going to, one of them is going to assume the polar opposite position of the other. That's survival. You know, you got an aggressive, assertive person, his counterpart who's close to him emotionally, physically, a sibling or whatever, is going to reverse that. And, you know, it need not be in his chart. You may have to manipulate the chart in order to find a reading that would suit that phenomena, but I think it's a fairly common phenomena that you see.
I have a suggestion. There's the only man that I know that's an expert on this is a man named Spencer Grendel out of Los Angeles. He has a master's in psychology from Harvard, and he has studied this with as many cases as he could get. Now, the number of cases are probably only about 75, which doesn't constitute a legitimate statistical study, but that's a larger number of cases. And of course, he feels essentially the same way. I would agree, except to say that psychology and astrology are in fact the very same thing. So if you see psychological traits, they should be apparent in some way in the chart. And if I didn't believe that, it'd be very easy for me to back out of this. I think that's a very good test of astrology.
Do you think really that psychologists would agree with you that psychology and astrology are the same thing?
I think I've got a quote laying here on the floor from Carl Jung that astrology is a more supreme system of psychology than anything else that psychology's devised, and he is considered about the most formidable voice.
Let me just say in response to that, you know, that it should be, yes, if astrology is valid, there should be that indication, but we have a situation where the birth chart is the same or similar. Maxine is saying she on her own initiation is switching these things around to get a valid reading. The reading that you get from setting up these 2 charts, which are either exactly the same or just a few minutes off, maybe different ascendant, whatever, but basically the same, is not valid because you have the behavior, polar opposite behavior of 2 siblings, and that is not coming out of the chart. She has to manipulate the chart by turning it around because that's the way she feels, you know, she can read this.
That's one technique, but the reason I recommended Mr. Spencer Grendel is because he has another technique which does not manipulate the chart or turn it around, which accounts for very fine differences where they're less than 2 minutes. And this technique, I've seen him present that case, and it's a fairly, he said, I don't claim to say that this works in 100% of the cases, but it's fairly convincing. Probably 85–90% of the cases, the technique that he suggests seems to work very well when we apply it to adult twins less than 2 minutes apart who have, you know, lived 20, 30, 40 years. So you can see considerable personality differences between them.
Terry, the skeptic of astrology would say what you've just said and all of that is you don't need astrology to explain what you just said.
Oh, I think you do, because I think what we're talking about is although the twins are very different, there are 1,000 ways that you can be opposite from each other. The point is sometimes not understanding what's opposite there, but what is really the content of their character. I mean, if one is aggressive and the other is passive, that's one way to be opposite. If one is an athlete and the other one is a very intellectual type, that's another way of being opposite. But it's very important to know whether you're looking at an athletic or an intellectual or an aggressive, or, as I think one of the interesting cases where two gentlemen that are born less than 2 minutes apart, where one has chosen a life of homosexuality and the other one is heterosexual.
Dr. Willen?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the interpretation of a chart. It's first of all, it's entirely subjective. In our The Facts on Astrology book, we state at least 7 independent studies have indicated that even with the best astrologers, there is little agreement as to the meaning of a chart. 7 additional studies revealed that people who have horoscopes interpreted for them cannot tell the difference between a right chart and a wrong chart, and even astrologers, professional astrologers, cannot tell the difference between a chart that is supposedly true and entirely reversed. And the chairman of the United Kingdom Astrological Association here is describing a person who is very meek, but astrology predicts should be aggressive. And he shows the problems you get into as an astrologer trying to interpret these, up to thousands of different variables. He says this, and he's criticizing astrologers. He says, if I found a very meek and unaggressive person with 5 planets in Aries, this does not cause me to doubt that Aries means aggression. I may be able to point to his Pisces ascendant, or to his Sun conjunct Saturn, or to his ruler in the 12th house, and if none of these alibis are available, I can simply say that he has not yet fulfilled his Aries potential. Or I can argue, as I have heard argued, that if a person has an excess of planets in a particular sign, he will tend to suppress the characteristics of that sign because he is scared that if he reveals them, he will carry them to excess. But if on the next day I meet a very aggressive person who also has 5 planets in Aries, I will change my tune. I will say he had to be like that because of his planets in Aries. The point is, as one of my instructors at the conference said, take any astrological indication you want. It can mean anything I darn well want it to mean.
Karen, maybe I could come to you. When you were actually giving advice as a professional astrologer in Chicago for 12 years, did you give out any morality with your astrology advice?
No suggestions or morality that was based on anything that I considered or led my client to believe was objective. My own preferences, when asked, as Maxine suggested, I did share with them. I did advise certain lines of action, but not, very much off the record to the client, not based on deterministic things that I saw in the chart, and not based on any moral objectivity, but just on my own preferences or how I saw the situation unfolding.
Dr. Martin, what do you think about that? What is the difference between astrology and Christianity right there?
Well, the difference is that in Christianity and in the biblical revelation, God speaks with authority and with certainty, and he calls men to repentance. There is a need for a change in the life, a change in the mind. In Christianity, there is the forgiveness of sin, the dealing with the problem of sin. There's also proven authority. Jesus said, you destroy this body, and in 3 days I will raise it up. If he didn't come back from the dead, as he said, his disciples would have been the first to disbelieve in him. So would the apostles. In Christianity,